A lot of the major developments in the disinformation space and these concerns about censorship really came to a head in 2020 during the 2020 presidential election and leading up to it when the Hunter Biden laptop story by the New York Post was suppressed. Going into this election, I think a lot of the groups are still active that have been involved in efforts to flag items to social media platforms. Some groups have started to slow down. A really good example of the Election Integrity Partnership was a coalition of nonprofits that the U.S. government was involved with. And in 2020, they came under fire because they were flagging examples to social media platforms of disinformation, misinformation, things that they just disagreed with and wanted platforms to remove. A lot of the groups involved in that partnership are still active.
Welcome to Reporter's Notebook, where we talk to the Washington Examiner's top journalists about the stories breaking on their beats. I'm Jim Antle, and I'm joined today by investigative reporter Gabe Kaminsky. Gabe, they tell us as journalists not to become part of the story, but sometimes that's unavoidable. And you've found yourself sort of in that situation lately. Walk us through a little bit about how you might have gotten in the crosshairs of some people who are not very happy with reality.
So last year at the Examiner, we reported on a State Department grant, $100,000 to an entity based in London called the Global Disinformation Index. A British group that we had found was secretly compiling a blacklist of conservative media outlets and feeding it to advertisers with the intent of defunding and shutting down those outlets. And so that reporting prompted some congressional oversight, a few lawsuits, a law through the NDA last year that banned certain funding to the entity funded by the State Department. I guess the New York Post last week had reported on an internal memo that the State Department had been circulating in 2023 in order to try to coach media outlets on how to respond to some of our reporting and also reporting by Matt Taibbi, who authored the Twitter files sets of documents from Elon Musk. The main controversy with regard to those internal documents was the Global Engagement Center, the State Department entity that funded the Global Disinformation Index, putting forth kind of incorrect claims about its involvement with social media platforms in 2020. The State Department said in that memo that they never had any involvement in coordinating with social media platforms, something we had proved was false, actually.
Right.
The second notable thing in this internal State Department press guidance was that it mentioned that Jim Banks, it misquoted Jim Banks as saying he was quoted in a Russian state-controlled media outlet in order to seemingly give the appearance that Jim Banks was speaking to a foreign adversary's press, when in fact Jim Banks had given that quote to the Washington Examiner.
And he's an Indiana Republican lawmaker who's running for Senate this year. Jim
Right.
Banks, yep.
Right, so that member of Congress was essentially branded by the State Department as speaking to Russia when he was speaking to our outlet. And so that actually prompted Jim Banks to send a letter to the State Department last week about this.
So in a lot of Russian disinformation has obviously loomed large in the presidential election of 2016, 2020. It's been discussed to some degree this year. But sometimes some of the things that are labeled disinformation are not.
Right, I think this it's an important point in that Jim Banks had wrote to Secretary of State Antony Blinken to say that, raising concerns over the fact that they were appearing to link his concern over apparent censorship or anti-First Amendment activity to Russia in the same way that there were attempts by individuals to falsely link the Hunter Biden laptop as being tantamount to Russian disinformation, which ended up being false, in the same way that Democrats had attempted to link former President Donald Trump to coordinating with Russia's government, which was also a false claim. So there's many examples of this.
Sure. So what is the actual definition of disinformation?
Well, so the notion of disinformation is someone intentionally pushing a false narrative in order to, I would say, harm the public good.
Which is different than simple misinformation in that it's actually deliberate.
Right. Misinformation and disinformation have that sort of separation. And in the sense of the Global Disinformation Index, the group we reported on, they seem to focus particularly, and it's in their name, right, disinformation. And so they had accused some stories in the Washington Examiner that they did not like as being tantamount to disinformation. They also as an example, flagged reporting on the COVID-19 lab leak theory as being, in their mind, disinformation, which the FBI, even the FBI actually said last year that the COVID-19 lab leak theory was the most likely origin of the virus. So that pretty much, and the Energy Department the year before, so that completely throws that theory to the side.
Sure. And so we're getting really close to a presidential election now. Where do we sort of go from here? I mean, some of these things really seem to heat up the closer we get to an election.
Yeah, so a lot of the major developments in the disinformation space and these concerns about censorship really came to a head in 2020 during the 2020 presidential election and leading up to it when the Hunter Biden laptop story by the New York Post was suppressed. Going into this election, I think a lot of the groups are still active that have been involved in efforts to flag items to social media platforms. Some groups have started to slow down. A really good example of the Election Integrity Partnership was a coalition of nonprofits that the U.S. government was involved with. And in 2020, they came under fire because they were flagging examples to social media platforms of disinformation, misinformation, things that they just disagreed with and wanted platforms to remove. A lot of the groups involved in that partnership are still active, groups like the Atlantic Council, groups at an office at Stanford University. So I don't know if it's entirely clear how these groups will be reacting to 2024, but they're still getting a lot of money. We reported actually this week that Democratic mega donor George Soros donated $250,000 recently to the Global Disinformation Index. And so there's still a lot of money there, and we'll have to see how that kind of develops.
Always got to wait for those October surprises. Thank you, Gabe. You can read Gabe and the rest of our investigative team's coverage at washingtonexaminer.com.